some staff have asked me to put together my reflections on the Flint event. And so you're getting, which I'll leave behind as kind of a legacy, if you will. And you're getting a precursor to it. Every time I give this talk, which this is like the, I don't know how many times, I change it because someone asks a question and I say, hey, yeah, I gotta include something about that next time. I'll try to be brief, so I'll give you some time for questions. I've got more slides than I can talk about in detail, but I'll tell you the story. People often ask what it was like working on the Flint water situation, and I usually say three things. It was humbling, it was hard, and it was heartbreaking. It was humbling in the fact that I did not know all the things I did not know about the intricacies of corrosion control and the lead copper rule and other such things. It was hard. For the first 4 months of the event, I worked in the Unified Command Center, Unified Coordination Center rather, with all the state and federal partners in Flint. And people spit at us, people yelled at us. We had to be escorted to our cars by the police or the National Guard. It was a tough, hard situation. I didn't wear my DEQ shirt, I'll tell you that. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see a lot of good people who were just doing their jobs, who've been hurt by this. Some of the long-term ramifications of all of that are yet to be determined, but still, they're already hurt. And it was heartbreaking to see the people of Flint, who certainly, there was hurt there, don't get me wrong, but there also was a tremendous amount of hype that hurt them even more than the actual event. I'm convinced of that, too. So, with that as a little intro, the most infamous water plant in the world, Flint water treatment plant. You've seen it before, I'm sure, many times on the news. A little history on the plant. It was constructed, the recent portion of the plant, the new plant, if you will, was constructed in 1950s. But then in the 1960s, 67, the city decided to go on what was then Detroit Water and Sewerage Department water from their Lake Huron water treatment plant. And you see, that's over on Lake Huron. And the finished treated water from that Detroit plant was pumped to the city of Flint. And today as we speak, that's now their source of water again, I might add. But that started in 67-ish. What happened that caused this event to develop? Well, in 2013, the city of Flint decided to go in with the county and their customers with a Lake Huron water source similar to what they were getting from Detroit. And that decision, well, you know, you probably hear lots of things about the state made that decision, the DEQ made that decision. I don't pretend to know all the behind-the-scenes things, but on the surface, the city council voted and approved that decision. This is who made the decision official. So, once the city decided to go in with that Carrigander Water Authority deal, then Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, now Great Lakes Water Authority, gave them a termination notice in terms of their long-term customer contract that they had enjoyed. And essentially it was going to cost them more money now because they were going to lose them as a customer. And so some folks decided it was good to, well, we have a water plant. We have the Flint River. That water plant treated the Flint River for many years successfully. We should fire it up. So here's the picture in early March of 2014 of city officials doing kind of a groundbreaking ceremony, if you will, to fire up the new water plant, fire up the existing water plant with this new source. So at the end of April 2014, they actually did start up that water plant. Here's a celebration of folks who were celebrating the fact that now Flint was treating its own water from the Flint River, and it's going to save a lot of money. I mean, that was true. They were going to save a lot of money. Now, a little about the Flint water treatment plant. Some of you know water treatment in this room. I know some of you are air and waste folks, but basically it was a complete treatment surface water plant designed to treat the Flint River. That's what the plant was designed for that. It was a softening plant. It was upgraded using a lot of state and federal monies, drinking water revolving fund money in the late 90s, early 2000s. There's nothing wrong with the water plant. There was nothing wrong with the water plant then and now. They could have made good water. You've probably seen some recent reports, various engineering analyses, various water alternatives for the city of Flint to propose putting $100 million or thereabouts into this water plant to bring it up to speed. Well, there's truth in that, but about half of that was for a raw water reservoir and appurtenances, pipe and pumps, etc. Another $10 million was for other things not directly related to treatment. There was very little of those proposed upgrades that really had impact on the ability of that water plant to treat water. So shortly after they fired up their water plant at the end of April, just a couple weeks into the new water source, they started getting aesthetic water quality complaints. And some of these water quality complaints were, they were substantial in terms of iron, taste and odor, that kind of thing. Now, new source, new flow directions, new lots of things. Nobody got too awfully concerned at this point in time. Then later in August 2014, they started getting some positive bacteriological tests in the system. So that obviously raised a little higher level of concern. And then the end of, or October of 2014, the General Motors plant, which was the largest paying customer of the city of Flint, decided to go off of Flint water and go back on the Great Lakes Water Authority water through the township. So they lost that big customer, that big revenue source too, and they still have not gained that revenue source back in my head, even though they're back on legal water. The things that water systems do in response to water quality issues, they did. They responded to complaints, they flushed the system. That hydrant showing red water flowing. I don't mean to imply that the water was like this everywhere in the system all the time by any means. It's just like some of you in your communities, if your public water supply says they're going to be flushing, they often will notify customers and say, guess what, we're going to be flushing in your area next week, you might experience some red water, that kind of thing. So I mean, it's fairly common when you flush at the beginning to get red water. But there was more than usual, let's be honest about that. And then they had a trihalomethanes violation, 8 in 2014, disinfection byproducts. Some of that was because of the reaction to the bacteria problems. So the increased chlorine dose, and that of course increases disinfection byproducts. All those things are related. Water treatment's a balance, you know that. And then in December 2014, they actually had a violation for trihalomethanes. So, what was the DEQ doing through all this? You know, I know you get the impression the DEQ was probably doing nothing. I should tell you that I wasn't involved in any of this leading up to the event. So I did not become involved until the recovery. So I was chief of the waste division at the time this was developing. And end of December, early January 2016 is really when I started to become involved. They asked me to start helping out with various things. But, stepping back, what was the DEQ doing? So, the DEQ required the city of Flint to do full-scale lead copper monitoring, which for them was 100 samples based on a presumed population above 100,000 at that time. And they required them to do 2 sets of full-scale 6-month monitoring. So the first set was July through December 2014, the next set was January through June 2015. So when that first set came in, the 90th percentile value of all those samples was 6 parts per billion. Many of you probably know the federal and state action level for the lead copper rule for lead is 15 parts per billion. And so if a water system does their compliance sampling and they are at or below 15 parts per billion, they don't have to do further actions. And so that first round came in at that time and, you know, didn't look all that horrendous. So second round came in and it was creeping up. There's reasons why it was creeping up. But it was 11 parts per billion. So still below the action level of 15, right? And, but this is when staff, I'm told, again, I wasn't directly involved in the program, that it's creeping up. You're going to have to do a complete corrosion control study and figure this out, figure out what's going on, okay? Of course, this is about the time when we pretty much lost control of the situation, too. We came way above staff level to manage at this point. It's just a blow off of the same information. So, through the entire event, the city never exceeded a federal or state action level for that. Never did. So that's a pretty important piece of information. So then in the summer of 2015, Marc Edwards and his students come to town and start doing some sampling all over town. And I got to know Marc pretty well in the last year. I spent a long time with him. And I think he's kind of a misunderstood person in many ways. I've grown to like him. He's a nice guy. You know, he has had a bit of a rub at times with water industry folks, as most of you know. Anyways, he did sampling all over town. His first set, he reported 120 samples, that 20% of those samples were above the federal action level of 15. So he said the water is really corrosive. And again, the standard, the federal and state standard, is the 90th percentile, or in other words, you can have 10% of your sample results above 15. So twice as many above the action level. So this was a wake-up call to a lot of folks. It was a wake-up call to me in a sense. I was, again, in another program. I wasn't in the drinking water program, but I said, I wonder what the heck's going on here. And I'll get back to this. So, some other confounding factors going on that you never hear anybody talk about. You never do. The winters of 2014 and 2015 were some of the coldest on record in the Midwest. So there was an excessive number of water main breaks in all water systems, not just Flint, but especially in Flint, because several reasons. Oversized water system, very little capital investment in the last 20 years. And so they had an excessive number of water main breaks in those years. Now, you can have the most perfect, non-corrosive water in the world, however you choose to define that. And if you have water main breaks, extreme velocities, changes in flow directions, it's going to strip every coating we've created off those pipes over the last several decades. This is a major cause of the event. So just for Flint, if you look at the years before and the year after the event, about twice as many water main breaks in that city. Corrosion consideration. So, you know, we think of corrosion chemically as oxidation of metal And in water systems, we typically have iron components, lead components, copper components, zinc components. Zinc support is a component of galvanized lines. And so when those are oxidized, when corrosion occurs, some portion of that ends up in the drinking water. That's all there is to it. Another point I like to make is the coating on the inside of a line. And this is a lead service line. And it shows a very thin, nice coating, a passivation layer inside of that pipe, which is the goal of adding treatment, phosphate particularly, is to line that pipe to inhibit or limit the amount of direct contact that water has with the piping materials. But the coating itself contains lead. Okay? The coating itself contains lead. So lead carbonate, lead phosphate, if you're adding phosphate to coat pipes like many systems do, lead oxide is from chlorination of systems. And so if you knock that coating loose, you have lead particulates in the water, which can happen through many means, but one of which is what I talked about, the water main. So how do we measure corrosion? This is one thing that I've learned a lot about through this event. You know, traditionally in water treatment, we talked about the Langmuir index, which is a measure of the calcium depositing aspect of water. If the Langmuir index is positive, it means it's depositing calcium, and it will actually fill up a water pipe if it's too positive, if you will, when conditions are right. And if it's negative, it will dissolve. Okay? So we've looked at that index for years as being a measure of corrosivity. So how many times have you heard on the news the corrosive Flint River water, the corrosive Flint River water 10,000 times? The river water was not corrosive, at least according to this index. You'll see the blue lines at the top is the raw river water, and it was actually less corrosive than the water they were receiving from Great Lakes Water Authority in Detroit. Now, the treated water, the green lines on the bottom, was indeed corrosive. So I don't want to miss that important point. This was a human-made event. Okay? And so I mentioned that corrosivity index, Langmuir not being so good probably for lead. At least we know now that it's not so good, though at the time this event was developing, a lot of people still thought it was a real good index. Probably a better index is this chloride sulfate ratio. And while certainly this information was known at the time this event was developing, it's a lot more well known now. And it's really just an empirical thing. There's no theory that really defines it and tells you how it works per se. But there was a study done that basically looked at all the public water supplies, or many public water supplies across the country. And those public water supplies that had a chloride sulfate mass ratio less than 0.58, they all, I believe, met the 90th percentile action level values for lead and copper. And they didn't start seeing systems that exceeded that until they got above that. Again, an empirical number, not a theoretical number. Now, what do you suppose the water was coming in from Detroit prior to the event, prior to April of 2014? Well, what do you suppose the chloride sulfate mass ratio was? Do you want to guess?
Less than?
No, it was about 1. It was about 1. What do you suppose it is today?
1?
It's about 1. They're back on good water. So we have the water plant calculate that, and it's included on their weekly MORs. So just because you're over that number doesn't mean absolutely you're going to have a corrosivity problem, but it's just one more indicator in this complicated puzzle of what may be affecting corrosion. This is kind of a case study of a water plant in Columbus, Ohio that switched coagulants from an alum coagulant, aluminum sulfate, to a ferric chloride coagulant. And just that one simple treatment changed that chloride sulfate mass ratio, as you can see, increased it, and caused them, or at least it's one factor that probably was causing them from being, if you will, below the action level in their 90th percentile sampling to above the action level the next round. And I should, before I get off this topic, what do you suppose Flint's chloride sulfate mass ratio was when they were treating Flint River water? What do you suppose it was like in April of 2014 when they first started? No, I guess I told you it was about 1 coming in from Detroit, higher than the 0.5 magic, 0.58 magic number.
Less than?
No, it was 1. It was in the 3 range.
No.
But it didn't get really high until 2015. There's reasons for that. And so, because of response to the vacuum problems and other issues, DHMs, treatment changes at the plant. And so, unfortunately, we think that the Flint event occurred from April 2014 when they first started treating water until October 2015 when they went back on Gleeville water. And it was all really corrosive and bad at that time. Not true. In fact, particularly during that early time and those early monitoring periods, we showed it wasn't that bad. It didn't become really bad until that summer of 2015. And it actually, in terms of tap monitoring, became worse when they went back on Detroit water. I'll let you think about why that is here in a minute. It was not while they were on river water. So, how many times have you heard on the news, whoever it was who decided not to add 1 part per million of phosphate to the water, be it the DEQ, be it the water plant, be it a manager, whoever it was, they're the guilty party and they caused all this corrosivity stuff to happen. How many times have you heard that? Yeah, thousands. Not true. Not true. Phosphate is certainly one of many corrosivity factors that affect water. And it certainly would have had some impact, but I don't believe it would have prevented this event. You know what the city of Flint is maintaining for a phosphate level right now in their distribution system? 3.1 milligrams per liter. 3.1. I don't think 1 would have made any difference at all. Any measurable difference, I really don't. But all these other things affect corrosivity. That's why, unfortunately, we like to simplify things into 1 or 2 things for a short message. Water treatment is really complicated, just like everything else in life that you all deal with. pH, alkalinity, hardness, temperature, time, total dissolved solids, velocity, change in water treatment, dissolved oxygen, chloride high, sulfate low, that chloride sulfate ratio, chlorine itself, and the type of chlorine. Actually, chloramines are typically more corrosive than free chlorine. All these things affect corrosivity. And the things on this list that are seldom mentioned by anybody are, well, the velocity is high issue and the water main break connection to this whole event that nobody mentions, which I just told you. And there's one other really big one, which nobody ever talks about. And that is contact time. And that is one of the reasons, in my opinion, why the very worst tap sample results occurred in 2016 after they were back on Detroit water. Because what happened at that time? I might be getting ahead of myself. People quit using the water. And so as soon as that emergency order was declared in January of 2016, people wouldn't drink the water, they wouldn't bathe in the water, they wouldn't use the water. The contact time in those houses that were getting sampled was weeks old in some cases. And so we actually have the highest lead sample results after they're back on Detroit water than during the event itself. Now, they weren't supposed to be drinking the water, so that's a good thing. But it's incredible how people have interpreted those emergency directives and have, if you will, prolonged the recovery of the system. As a result, I read in a newspaper article recently, some guy was still flushing his toilet with bottled water. That's it. Why? But I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going on to this very day. Another issue that most people don't mention is the effect of change on corrosivity and stirring up sediments and stripping coatings. This really didn't become apparent to me until I went to the first data summit in Chicago. We've had 3 such summits with EPA, DEQ, federal state partners, and independent researchers like Marc Edwards, Virginia Tech. Everybody brought their data to town, if you will, and said, here's what it is, what's it mean? We've had 3 of those events since this emergency was declared. The very first one, EPA corrosion experts, Darren Lytle, Mark Schock, some of those folks who are truly national experts in this. Darren Lytle showed this graph and some others relative to some of those water quality parameters I showed you. And so in between those bars there is essentially the period of time when that water plant was operating. And you notice how they're on the gas, off the gas. It's like there was no steady operation of that water plant during that period of time. And I've often said, water distribution systems are like orthodox people. They hate change. They hate change. And even if that change is in the right direction, the constant change stirs things up, strips lines, and makes things worse. And so that's another factor that you never hear about, but I think it's important. Where does the lead come from? Well, I think most of you know, most of the lead comes from customers' own piping and appurtenances from the service line in to the house all the way up to the tap. In the case of Flint, we thought that about half of their 30,000 some service lines were lead, and based on city records. And I'm not slaying Flint for this because every other city is the same way. I mean, the reality is it's hard to find lead service lines. No city has good records on their lead service lines. But there's the gooseneck piece, the piece from the water main to the curb stop, which is municipal owned, if you will. It's typically in the road or in the right of way. And there's the piece from the curb stop to the house, which is typically plumbing owned by the homeowner. And of course, within the house, there's piping, not typically lead piping, but there's often galvanized piping. And copper piping with lead solder, and fixtures with lead components. So brass fixtures have a percentage of lead in it, for example. And so for the most part, the lead is coming from the customer's own plumbing. There's no lead coming from the water plant. There's no lead coming from the distribution system for all practical purposes. For the most part, lead at the tap is coming from the customer's own plumbing. Now, the lead copper rule has been criticized about not being adequate and not finding the highest risk sites and not actually sampling the lead service lines or where the worst case scenario is. There's some truth in that. But I defy anyone to develop a sampling protocol which you could apply across this nation that would do that. As part of this process, EPA worked with us. EPA, I give them all the credit, really. They came up with this idea. They sampled 300 some houses in Flint sequentially. So they took, instead of the standard compliance 1 liter bottle, yay big, they took sequential 125 milliliter samples. And they would just keep taking them until they got back to zero, basically, when they knew they were at the water main. So that they could tell where the lead was coming from in a customer's house, from the tap all the way back to the water main. And so this is just a couple of them, and you can actually go on our Flint Water website and see all kinds of these results. But the point is, every house is different. So you can't come up with a single one bottle sampling protocol that's going to catch the worst case scenario on every site. I don't believe it can be done. Another big wake-up call, I mentioned Dr. Marc Edwards' work in August 2015 and before. Another big wake-up call was this work by Dr. Mona Hanna-Tisha, and I've got to know her well too, really nice person, like her a lot. And she's a pediatrician in Flint, and she published a study that predicted higher levels of blood lead levels in certain areas of the city based on her work with her own patients. And this was certainly another wake-up call for people at high levels of government. And she said that the incidence of elevated blood lead levels among Flint children under age 5 nearly doubled from 2.1% to 4% during this period of time of her study, which she put back in that early time of the water switch, I might add. That early time, not that later time when our data shows the higher tap set. And that standard is just a benchmark, just like the 90th percentile 15 part per billion action level for drinking water. It's not a health standard. It's just a measure of corrosivity of the water system is really what it is. And even this blood lead level benchmark of 5 is just a benchmark. There is no safe level of lead. This is one of the mantras that has come out of this event, and it's true. There is no safe level of lead. But there's no safe level of a lot of things we eat and drink every day. And most of us in this room know that most of our regulations are based on some risk assessment. Be it a 1 in a million risk or a 10 to the minus 5 risk or whatever it is. There's some risk with everything. But that standard actually from 10 to 5, that's really a recognition of the reductions in blood lead level concentrations over many decades. I think there's a lot about this. The city was built for 200,000 to 300,000 people and large industry. Now it has less than 100,000 people and no large industry. And so most of the water system is oversized. And so that affects the contact time, of course, like I mentioned. It's a huge issue. And water quality in general, it's a challenge because of those facts. And environmental justice. You know, I used to spend some time in the waste programs and the air programs, and it seemed like there were some pretty direct connections to some things there in environmental justice. And I used to think, well, in drinking water, we don't really have environmental justice issues because, well, we supply the same quality drinking water to everybody. Well, here's one of the eye-opening learning things for me, the humbling things for me. And I guess I knew this if I had been questioned about it, but I guess this whole event caused me to question it. But poor women typically don't breastfeed. There's a reason for that. And the baby that is drinking formula made from tap water can get 80–90% of their lead intake from that bottle, as opposed to the other environmental influences of lead, like paint and dust, like we say for other folks. And so there are some environmental justice connections to this drinking water thing. Recovery timeline. They went back on Detroit Water in October 2015. In December 2015, they boosted the dose of orthophosphate so that it would be, so it would repassivate, recoat the pipes quicker. And January 5, 2016, a state of emergency was declared. The state started distributing free commodities, filters, and water, and still do a lot of that work this very day through pods, the point of delivery systems, and through our core team house visits in Flint to this very day. We started following up on every high sample result, and first and foremost, and we wanted to make sure they had safe water, so make sure they had a filter installed properly. We know about the water, but we also, while we were there, we gave them information about how to get their blood lead levels tested, how to, we helped them assess their plumbing. We'd go down their basement if they allowed us and physically look at the line coming in the house to try to identify lead service lines for sampling and other reasons. We developed a sentinel sampling program, which we're still continuing on to this day, where we wanted to define the sites, educate the homeowner on how to collect the samples, so we'd have a more stable sampling set, if you will, to watch the recovery of the system over time. Started that in February. And our most recent round was completed in February, and you can see that red line is the 90th percentile 15 part per billion line. And so until, I can't get this thing to work. There we go. So last May is when we, if you will, consistently broke past that compliance line, if you will. It's not really correct to call it a compliance line, but those rounds, every round since May of 2016, the 90th percentile was at or below 15 parts per billion. And so in that respect, you can see the system continues to recover. The most recent 2 rounds were 8 parts per billion. So, school testing, we did extensive school testing in every school in Flint, which, by the way, a school that's on a public water supply is typically not tested at all. Did you know that? Because they don't qualify as a Tier 1 site. It's a long story, but so generally we have no data on those things. So we tested all the schools in Flint, and guess what? They were all bad. They were all hot. So we essentially replaced all the fixtures in every school in Flint. And now we have a grant program, a statewide grant program administered by the Michigan Department of Education, where all schools can test or replace fixtures in their schools. Lead line investigations, I mentioned how hard it is to find lead. I couldn't believe in this day and age when we can send someone to the moon, how we can't tell what plumbing material is a few feet underground. It's amazing to me. We had people come in from the military with their sonar and their radar and say, oh yeah, we can tell you. And they were about as good as the weatherman, 50% accurate. The only way to do it is to excavate around that curb step and look at the line in both directions. And that's exactly what is going on in Flint right now. I mentioned here the replacing lead and galvanized service lines. One of the great ahas, learnings for me, is that galvanized lines are just as bad, if not worse, than lead. And so the rule doesn't recognize this. You know, it requires a water system that is over the action level for its 90th percentile. One of the action steps is to start replacing lead service lines. It doesn't talk anything about galvanized service lines. I guarantee you, based on the Flint experience, that if you leave your galvanized lines in the ground, you haven't fixed the problem. And it's because, not because they have such a lead component, usually very little if any, but because they're more of a porous material, and they have been collecting lead particulates for 50, 100 years, and they're going to keep emitting those particulates. Get this for now. It's been a legal conundrum. My favorite lawyer, Saul Goodman. That's where I get my legal advice. We'll go there. I credit Governor Snyder. You know, he has really stepped up and taken responsibility for this event and stumped for funding. I mean, I really can't say enough about what he's done. And there's few people, few governors that would have stepped out on a limb and stumped for the money and the services that have been provided. Filters have become the norm in Flint. Tap filters, which you know we gave away. They're certified for 150 parts per billion by NSF to remove that level of lead concentration. So early on in this event, early on, again, after their back in Detroit water, February, March of 2016, when we were getting these really high numbers, I said, well, geez, I'm getting 500, I'm getting 1,000. Will this filter that's rated by NSF at 150 parts per billion, will it work? And so we did a very extensive study with CDC and EPA and a lot of other folks, and they tested filters at over 3,000 parts per billion, and they were very effective. And so that's one thing we learned, those filters are very, very effective at removing them. Governor wants to propose some LCR revisions. Originally that was proposed to be in statute, now it's going to be a stakeholder process run by the DEQ, lowering the action level and requiring follow-up on high levels in individual houses, such as we were doing with those home visits like I mentioned to you, and some other things. Also out of this event came the lead poisoning elimination board. And I know we have some other folks on the DEQ. I think Deb McKenzie Taylor's on that board, right?
The board was all that.
Okay. So it's a good thing. It recognizes, of course, that lead exposure is multifaceted in terms of media. It's not just drinking water. In fact, generally, except for perhaps those infants and such that I mentioned to you, generally it's these other medias that contribute the larger amount of lead. Legionella. This has been a really interesting one. And first of all, Legionella is ubiquitous in the environment and in public water supply. So there's all kinds of occurrence data across the United States. And if you test for it, you're going to find it. And it's generally, well, you can drink it, it won't hurt you. It has to be, the microbe has to get into your lungs. So it has to be aspirated or inhaled in some way. That's how you would get sick from it. In February 2014, the DHHS, our State Department of Health and Human Services, issued an order against McLaren Health Services, a big hospital in Flint. Basically, they traced the specific microbes for the outbreak and tied it to the hospital, as opposed to the water system in general. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Lead levels overall. So I don't pretend to be an expert in this, but I do know that our Department of Health and Human Services tracks this kind of information across the whole state, not just in Flint. And so the most recent report was published in March 16, and that had all the 2015 blood lead level results across this whole state. Lenawee County, by the way, had the highest blood lead levels. Lenawee County, wasn't Genesee County. So I'm scratching my head on that one a little bit myself. Detroit had nearly double the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels. And by the way, Detroit did their lead copper water tap monitoring last summer. You know what their action level was? Or their 90 percentile value was? 4 parts per billion. Very, very low. Also, if you go on our Flint Water website, you'll see all those blood lead level results. They get posted periodically and updated. I think this is one of the most recent trends here, but this is 2014 right here. You see this peak? But you see this peak in 2015? And you see this peak, partial peak, not quite completed yet in 2016. And you see this peak here, and you see this peak here. So if you were to isolate all the blood lead level data and only look at this peak right here at the beginning of the water event, you might come to the conclusion that the increased blood lead levels in But you know, when you look at it over time, you gotta see, you know, there's kind of a trend here. Call it a seasonal trend, maybe? There are other factors contributing to that. The big news recently, the week before last, with a press conference in City of Flint, the mayor announced that her long-term water source choice would be to stay with GLEWA, Great Lakes Water Authority, in the long term for its primary source of water. And that would prevent the need to rebuild the water plant. They could use that money to fix up the distribution system, which is in major need of that. And prevents switching of water, which switching, change in and of itself is hard and sometimes unpredictable. And so it's a good thing, I think. We're under public comment right now, so let's see, there was a town hall meeting in Flint on April 20th, and that was the start of a 30-day public comment period, so we're getting input from residents. Obviously, we need the city council to buy in to make this happen, but this is what the mayor is recommending, which is, I think, a good thing. And with that, I would be happy to take questions. I might have gone over time, I apologize. Yeah.
I saw on an earlier slide that in 1992 it looked like the lead level was up at 14.4.
That was before treatment. So the lead copper rule went into effect in the early 90s, and all large systems had to do 2 6-month monitoring rounds, and then they stopped monitoring, and then they did an optimum corrosion control study, and then they implemented treatment, that all took about 4 years ago, and then they had to start sampling again. And so those high results were before they had implemented, Detroit had implemented corrosion control treatment at their water treatment plants. And this was pretty typical across the country. And so, again, before 1991, 92, there was no lead copper rule. People didn't even monitor taps. This was considered plumbing. This was not considered the responsibility of a public water supply. So the lead copper rule all of a sudden shifted that and said, okay, the public water supply is responsible for what's come out of a customer's plumbing by virtue of saying you have to optimize corrosion control to minimize the leaching of lead at that point. So it's a whole shift in thinking and philosophy.
The other one that was the seasonal ebb and flow, blood level, like second quarter, third quarter, it shoots up. Is that
right? If you look at that, it's springtime, summertime, playing outside.
So is it something that's Michigan, or that be kind of nationwide, or?
Well, that was just Michigan data, but I would be shocked if it didn't apply nationwide. Anything else? Yes, sir.
What are the other water systems around Michigan doing differently or have done differently since Flint? And what would be required with a new lead and copper rule? What kind of major undertaking and change in practice or investment would be needed if that was to be lowered?
So several things rolled into one there. So first of all, what we as a department have done, we have notified all public water supplies of a lot of these learnings and advised them, number one, to get their lead service line inventory up to snuff and figure out where they are. If some of those things in the lead copper rule are changed, it'll be required. They have to update their inventory and develop a long-term plan to remove them. Another learning for me that came out of this is, you can't optimize corrosion control for everything. And so generally when optimization studies have been done, it's been to minimize the leaching from a lead service line, which in a lot of homes, that is the largest component of lead contribution, if you will. But in Flint, we're going to remove all the lead service lines. So right now, we're optimizing corrosion control and starting an extensive study at the water plant to optimize that for lead service lines. By the time that's all done and implemented 2 years from now, the lead service lines will all be gone. And here's the great learning of that. When you optimize it for lead leaching from a service line, you make it worse for leaching from a brass fixture. And so, you know, this is the water treatment balance thing. You change one thing, you help one thing, you hurt another. And now, of course, there's new rules that have gone into play to minimize the amount of lead that can be in approved plumbing fixtures now, you know that. But it's still going to be a number of years before those are all changed out. And people love their brass fixtures. And some of the nicest homes in Flint with very expensive brass fixtures emitting all kinds of lead. The people would not allow us to change out their fixtures to get them. They said, we'd rather have the lead, and I love my fixtures. So. But relative to the rule of reduce, here's the big ticket items. Reduce the 90th percentile value action level from 15 parts per million to 10. Require inventory of all lead service lines. And develop a long-term plan to remove them. Follow up on all high results, individual home high results, not just system-wide. And develop citizen advisory committees for communities with a population of 1,000 or more. So those are some of the big items. There's a lot of other things too, of course. Yes, sir.
What are the reasons behind their seeming inability when they were treating the Flint water to have a consistent quality? Was it more the water breaks and the wildly fluctuating demands in the flow? Was it the inconsistency of the intake source from the river as opposed to the more consistent source from Lake Huron conservation?
Well, there's some contribution from all those things. And I say this with all due respect. But the water plant operators had no real long-term experience operating that water plant. And so when something would change, they would react to it, maybe overreact to it. Then, oh, shit. There was a lot of that going on. And so that water plant was operated quarterly just for a short period of time and pumped to waste just so that it was ready to serve. The plant was rebuilt really with the thinking that it's only going to run for a short period of time. If that transmission line coming from Detroit goes down, it was really, I worked on that. I was water treatment specialist at the time. I worked on the ozone system for that plant. I never conceived of the fact that that plant would be operated continuously for a long time.
It was set up to be essentially an emergency.
It was an emergency, yeah. So
they were almost stuck as an operator on positive feedback. They don't want to correct.
yeah, and you know, you can design a water plant perfectly. The engineers always get slayed for poor design. But the operators, they learn all the idiosyncrasies of a water plant. They really learn how to operate it and tweak it and make it work even though it may not be designed perfectly. And all those kind of things you only gain by continuous operating experience. That's the only way you get that experience. Yes, sir.
So it seems that you've indicated that water main breaks, fluctuations in the plant operation, changes in customer usage pattern during the actual crisis were major factors that have been overlooked in this entire thing.
I haven't overlooked them, but
They're
not the kind of things. They're not the kind of things you typically hear about, right?
Why?
Because they're complicated. You know, it's much easier to say you didn't have 1 part per million of phosphate, therefore this caused all this grief.
But there's been so much study and so much review of it by now. Why has that not been part of the reports that have come out? Is that, I mean, does the interagency commission, has the task forces not communicated that? Have they not looked at it?
Some of them have individually, yes, but it's not a part of any official report that I know of. So let's put it down. Yes, sir.
You just addressed one human factor, I mean, the operation of the plant itself by its operators. Are there other human factors that became part of the chain of events relating to Flint with respect to, for example, communications, decision-making, whatever?
Yeah. I'm sure there were. Again, this was before I was really involved, but I'm sure there were, yes. But can't speak to specifics there. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Bryce, what's being done at the MDEQ to capture the learning that you've had and make that part of institutional knowledge so as we go forward and another situation like this arises, you have the ability to make sure you can grab that knowledge and use it in a fun way going forward? How are you doing that? Because you're obviously leading the organization.
So, I've struggled with that, trust me, because we're all brilliant in hindsight. I'm pretty smart looking back on this event. But where was I in April of 2014? Looking at the data I had before me. Where were all the detractors who said we really screwed up at that point? Many of them were looking at the data. Where were they? You know, we're all pretty smart now. But put yourself April 2014 and look at the data before you. A water plant that was designed to treat this water. No reason why it shouldn't have been able to treat this water. I'm not sure any person could have predicted that. Certainly the learnings about chloride sulfate ratios, those things are incorporated into our district staff thinking now. In fact, we have it on our monthly operation reports for water plants now, things like that. But even that is just one other indicator. You know, there were so many things, as you saw, that contributed to the event. I don't think any person could have orchestrated this if they'd tried. You know, you heard that early in the event that somehow somebody tried to make this happen. Really? How could you possibly control all those things? You know? It's like when an airplane crashes, 3, 4, 5 redundant things go wrong all at the same time. That's what happened to Flint. A number of things went wrong. And I don't think anybody could have predicted it. I really don't. So I think it's an anomaly. I pray it's an anomaly. Yes, sir.
Just a real practical, I don't know if I understood this correctly or not, but if I was to buy an old house in Flint, all right?
Or anywhere.
Or anywhere, but would it be prudent in a place that's been empty, for example, to run a few tubs full of water before you use the water?
Oh, absolutely.
And that, I mean, I almost got the sense that that remedy would have been as good as filtering the water. If everybody would run a tub full of water in the morning before the day starts, they got clean water in their pipes.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So I've been a proponent of flushing forever. I live in the country. I have my own well water, and it looks like that brown well water you saw that person holding up to that public meeting. Which probably explains some things about me. But I've always flushed my water. And I've always encouraged people. When I used to work in the Detroit area, people would call in and complain about chlorine. People don't like the smell or taste of chlorine. I said, well, it's real simple. Flush them out, fill up a jug, put it in your refrigerator, the odor will all go away. You'll have no lead or anything else in it, no measurable amount. That would solve so, you are so right. Now, in this day of water conservation, you know, there's been a lot of research recently about water quality and green buildings and how that's bad for water quality. That's true. I mean, you add to water age, you're going to diminish water quality. That's all there is to it. But if everyone would just flush their lines every day or fill up a jug for drinking out of flush water, it would solve so many problems without filters, without it all.
And if they're drawn from the Flint River, where's the outfall from the sewer system? It's back in the Flint River, right? Downstream?
Yeah, it's downstream.
I mean, so the water's either going to pass through and not get used and stay in the Flint River, or it's going to get diverted into the plumbing system, go through somebody's house, you fill up a tub, it goes down, and it gets back up in the river. So it's not really a water conservation problem, at least as far as this issue goes.
Okay, you can look at it that way.
Okay. If I buy a house, I'm going to keep that in mind.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Okay, one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Steve?
The system has too much capacity, volume-wise. What are they doing to address that?
So, short term, With the assistance of EPA, we've done extensive hydraulic modeling of the system, and we have installed automatic hydraulic flushers in various areas of the system that had long detention times and poor water quality. And so we've done that short term. Long term, we have a comprehensive distribution system study being performed by a consultant for the city, which is going to look at all those things. You know, what are the appropriate size transmission mains, what's the appropriate amount of storage, all those kind of things.